Hello, my name is Tiffany Han, and this week I have the honor of sharing with you about the life and work of Dorothy Day. She was a passionate and inspiring woman, and the legacy that she left in the midst of a very tumultuous time in America is every bit worth revisiting. Her greatest contributions came in the form of the Catholic Worker newspaper, Catholic Worker houses, publications, and retreat houses. But what she cultivated through those things were her real contributions. But before we dive into her life work, I would like to begin with a biographical introduction. Dorothy was born in Brooklyn, New York on November 8, 1897. Her family moved to San Francisco when she was 6, but moved only a few years later after her dad lost his sports journalism job due to the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. They moved to Chicago, and she spent the rest of her adolescence here, living a conventional middle-class lifestyle. It was during this time that she developed a passion for reading, from Dickens to Poe, and eventually authors who sparked a social consciousness within her, authors like Upton Sinclair and Tolstoy. Her family was nominally religious, but she herself was intrigued by the songs and readings when she did attend church. At the age of 13, she was baptized and confirmed in the Episcopal Church. She attended college at the age of 16 at the University of Illinois. But she left after two years in order to pursue a journalistic career writing on social issues. The first newspaper she worked for was actually a socialist paper. Therefore, she was influenced by socialists, communists, anarchists, and various freethinkers. She reported on issues concerning the gap between the poor and the wealthy, protests like those against the high cost of living and unemployment, women's suffragist movements, and many, many forms of what she identified as human misery. At this time in her life, she still had faith in God, but she did not believe in organized religion. She described her life during this time as dissolute, wasted, full of sensation and sensuality. Her lifestyle at this point led to multiple partners, an unwanted pregnancy that she aborted, and even an attempted suicide. After a time of searching, she finally settled back down in New York in a bungalow that she had bought on Staten Island. During this time, she entered into a common law marriage with a biologist named Forster, who she unexpectedly became pregnant and had a baby with. Forster had no interest in having children or in God, so their relationship ended when Dorothy decided she would have her baby Tamar baptized in the Catholic Church, and she herself would become a convert. In her adult life, she had been drawn to the Catholic Church, but this decision to baptize her daughter began her relationship with the Catholic Church, which she grew to admire as the Church of the Poor. She wrote for a Catholic Worker magazine, but after some time realized that her commitment to the work with the Catholic Church had separated her from those who were combating social issues. In her lifetime, she lived through the Great Depression, the Spanish Civil War, both world wars, in times of air raid drills, the Civil Rights Movement, and the Vietnam War. All of these occurrences would serve as pivotal times in the work of Dorothy Day. Around the time she began to feel this discontent with the work she was doing and the work she felt she ought to be doing, she met Peter Marin. He was a much older gentleman who was a French peasant who had been influenced by St. Francis of Assisi to live a voluntary life of poverty. Peter worked to change the social order through the social doctrines of the Catholic Church. He taught Dorothy the Catholic faith and philosophy. Together they started the Catholic Worker movement. It started with the Catholic Worker newspaper, which was in the midst of the Great Depression, the first edition coming out on May 1st, 1933. The Catholic Worker can be enjoyed by all workers, but its primary inspiration was for the poor, the dispossessed, and the exploited. She wrote about the conditions of workers in the labor movement, highlighting the struggles that were often only swept under the rug. Out of the Catholic Worker newspaper, came a community of volunteers who worked to feed, clothe, and support the homeless and unemployed who had been drawn in by this movement. Out of this was the first house of hospitality. These would be known as Catholic worker houses, where they would provide for the poor among them, advocate for the oppressed, and intentionally live life together. And she welcomed anyone in need, no questions asked. She once wrote, "The gospel takes away our right forever to discriminate between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor." Within years of the start of this movement, there were 33 Catholic worker houses and farms across the country, the farms which had been a vision of Peter Maurin's. Dorothy was a firm objector of war and a staunch pacifist. This eventually created problems, first arising during the Spanish Civil War. Even though some withdrew their support at this time, she did not waver on her beliefs. At the time of World War II, this divide only grew stronger. The war itself contributed to a decline in the movement, in part because of her stance, but also because many men were called off to war, and the unemployed found employment within the war efforts. After the war, there would be only 11 Catholic worker houses still operating. However, during this time, Dorothy took time away from the Catholic worker to spend in spiritual renewal and intense retreats. Out of this, she birthed retreat centers for participants to come and examine their conscience about their work, material goods, and attachments. She also tried to open a retreat center for the alcoholic priest, but the church leaders did not approve of such an endeavor. After the war, Peter Maurin, whose health had already been declining, died. This was a major loss for Dorothy. However, the movement continued on. In the 1950s, she and a group of other protesters protested air raid drills as she believed it was deceiving people into a false sense of security. Instead of the government actually taking measures to protect people, she felt they were only deceiving. So during the drills, they would sit on park benches rather than take cover. In the 1960s, Dorothy and the movement responded in solidarity with the Black community as the civil rights movement grew. Their articles advocated for equality, fair wages, and justice. During the Vietnam War, she continued to protest, advocating for nonviolence, which was received much better at this time compared to World War II. Also during that time, she was a part of a group who fasted in Rome on behalf of the decisions being made by the Second Vatican Council that would substantiate a stance on the Catholic Church and their beliefs of war. The Pastoral Constitution on the Church and the Modern World would state, "Certainly, war has not been rooted out of the human affairs. Those who devote themselves to the military service of their country should regard themselves as the agents of security and freedom of peoples. As long as they fulfill this role properly, they are making a genuine contribution to the establishment of peace. Any act of war aimed indiscriminately at the destruction of entire cities of extensive area along with their population is a crime against God and man himself." To Dorothy, this statement was seen as a good step in the right direction. Throughout her years in the Catholic worker movement, Dorothy was often accused of being a communist. She admits that she was at one point a communist in sympathy, but she had always felt its program lacked what only God and faith could do. Her convictions came from a deep sense of a work through Christ that would be transformational in a deeper and broader sense than even the material sense in which the worker itself sought to provide. For that reason, it was expected that the Catholic worker communities would be a place in which the poor and marginalized would feel that they were in the presence of a loving people and seen as equals. But that was to be achieved without proselytizing or discussing religion. Dorothy's heart was filled with compassion. Her eyes were unable to ignore the human misery and injustice that she saw. She was drawn to advocacy, care, and solidarity. Her convictions were rooted in an understanding of God and faith. Though she at times went head-to-head with leadership in the Catholic Church, she believed in the Church and what it stood for. And whether it was resistance to the government or to church leadership, she held true to her convictions. She was no stranger to being thrown in prison for her activism or receiving criticism from peers about how freely she opened her life and homes to those in need. But nonetheless, she continued. Dorothy Day was innovative, adaptable, and very reflective. She inspired change that still exists today, as there are still 185 active Catholic worker communities that exist in the U.S. today. Dorothy Day died on November 29, 1980. Following her death came the question of her canonization, which has not yet come to fruition. But to quote a piece from the Catholic Worker website, they say Dorothy Day is already a saint, which reminds us that the Church doesn't make saints, but only recognizes what the faithful acknowledge as the action of God's grace in a person's life. Dorothy was known for saying, "Don't call me a saint. I don't want to be dismissed so easily." She lived by choice a messy, impoverished life of service and compassion for Jesus, whom she served daily in the faces of those she encountered and embraced, fully believing, "I really only love God as much as I love the person I love the least." The life of Dorothy Day cannot be fully captured in a mere 15-minute presentation, but luckily there are many resources on her life, her work, and her influence. For my presentation, I used the info from the Catholic Worker Movement website, which is a rich resource for the life of Dorothy, but also for the life of Peter Maurin and the continued life of the Catholic Worker Movement. There are many biographies and even a couple of autobiographies on the life of Dorothy Day. The one that I used for my research was Dorothy Day, Dissenting Voice of the American Century. Thanks so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed this look into the life of Dorothy Day, and I look forward to our discussion.